Hello class, it's time to start our second video on chapter 1. So the first part we talked about the sociological perspective. In the second section we're going to be talking about the first couple theorists, and then in the last section we'll be talking about methods. So we reviewed sociology as a scientific study of human behavior. We talked about the sociological approach, and we also talked about the sociological imagination. Now we're going to talk about the leading theorists in sociology. So we're going to start with Auguste Comte. And Auguste Comte, who lived between 1798 and 1857, was credited with being a founder of sociology and is also considered to be the father of sociology. The reason this is the case is because he really led the charge in terms of making sociology its own field. Prior to Auguste Comte, sociology really was just part of economics and history, but he brought it into its own. And although he did not apply the scientific method himself, he suggested that that was the appropriate way to study society. Comte believed that we would be able to study society in a scientific way and uncover underlying kind of social laws that would allow us to reform society to make it better. So as a positivist, he applied the scientific method to social life. And as a social reformist, he actually believed that sociologists should reform society. So starting with that, let's ask the question, was Auguste Comte a basic sociologist or applied sociologist? It's going back and looking at the terms so you can answer the question. Basic sociology is analyzing aspects of society with the goal of gaining knowledge, while applied sociology is analyzing society with the ultimate goals of solving some type of social problem. So if he was a social reformist and thought we should change society, I would have to say that he was an applied sociologist. We'll go through and we'll kind of ask this about all of them. The second person we're going to talk about is Herbert Spencer. Now, although you might not know his name, you know his theory. He is responsible for the theory of natural selection, and he's the one that coined the term survival of the fittest. I know many of you probably thought it was Darwin, but it was actually Darwin who borrowed the theory from Spencer and applied it to biology. It wasn't Spencer who borrowed the theory from Darwin. And we remember it as social Darwinism. Who knows exactly why? I like to joke around and say we remember it as social Darwinism because social Spencerism just doesn't sound right. It doesn't roll off the tongue. But nevertheless, it was Spencer who coined the term survival of the fittest. And Spencer believed that societies were evolving from a lower to a higher form, basically from barbarianism to civilization. And since we were becoming more civilized, Spencer asserted that societies evolve over time to adapt to their environment. And he actually disagreed with Comte and thought that this was a natural process, and he believed social reform by sociologists would actually interfere in the process. So, would Spencer be an applied sociologist or a basic sociologist? Give you just a second to think about that. So, Spencer himself, just like Comte, he actually did not conduct scientific research, and therefore his theories on society, even though they're very well known today, have been abandoned by the academic field because there's not evidence to support his theory. And we're kind of big on evidence. Now, moving into some theorists who did do research and who are also extremely important and impactful in society. We're going to start with Karl Marx, who lived from 1818 to 1883, and he is the probably the most important influence on the development of the social conflict perspective. And the social conflict perspective essentially asserts that there's patterns of social inequality in society. So social conflict perspective draws the attention to the patterns of social inequality, and it does so on an economic basis. Karl Marx asserts or believed that economic inequality was the central force to social change. So what he meant by that was that inequality in society, specifically class inequality, was going to result in the most profound social change in our society through a revolution. That because the bourgeoisie and the proletariat were two great opposing classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat stand in direct opposition to each other. He believed that the workers would eventually unite and revolt against the bourgeoisie. Marx really proposed this radical change in society would result through a revolution. And that revolution would give us a classless society free of exploitation. So you may have heard of Karl Marx's ideas before. You've heard of socialism, and you probably connected it with communism. Marx himself was not a communist, and he asserted actually that he was not even a Marxist. But nevertheless, his ideas were used by politicians to assert their agenda, which was communism. Now, just before we move on, that's kind of your basics in terms of class conflict. But you should also know that you will hear the term bourgeoisie and proletariat used in a variety of different ways. So bourgeoisie, or the elite, the proletariat, or the working class. The elite and the working class, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the haves and the have-nots. And you may have heard these terms in everyday life and never actually noticed it. But the bourgeoisie would be the haves, the proletariat are the have-nots, the haves are the elite, and the have-nots are the working class. Moving on to our next leading theorist in sociology is Emile Durkheim. And if you notice the time frame, these people all pretty much lived around the same time, and these guys kind of knew of each other's works. Now, Emile Durkheim was credited as one of the founders of modern sociology, and he basically asserts that society is unique to itself, and you can't reduce it into its individual parts. That society itself is created when individuals' consciousness interact with each other and fuse together to create a new type of consciousness, what we call the collective consciousness, or a group understanding. So in other words, it's the way that we think as a whole group, as opposed to just as individual people. And that the society itself is greater than the sum of its parts. So if the society has a life of its own and changes and lives beyond you as an individual. So if you want to think about it in terms of relating it to yourself, you can think about how you were born into our society, but it existed before you got here. And you live in our society, and you may change it slightly or significantly, but once you die, society continues to live without you and move on and has a life on its own. Emile Durkheim also asserted that we could study society scientifically, and he actually did use the scientific method, and his theories actually are still valid today. And one of the reasons why is because since he used the scientific method, we were able to see his theories and assertions how would I put it, continue to be relevant in societies today. So one of the more famous type of research projects that he did was in terms of suicides, and Emil Durkheim studied the suicide rates of several European countries, and found that they all had different suicide rates. And he also found that those rates were consistent year after year. He also saw that the different groups in the society had different rates, and those remained stable over time from year to year. What he actually found was that males were more likely to kill themselves than female. Protestants were more likely to kill themselves than Jews or Catholics. Unmarried people were more likely to kill themselves than married people. And what he came to understand is that social integration in society is a key factor in whether or not you may kill yourself, you may commit suicide. So what social interaction actually is it's a degree to which people are tied to their social group. So married people are tied to their community and their family more than unmarried people. People who are Catholic or Jewish are tied into their community through their religion more than people who are Protestant. Women are tied in more to their family and their community than men. And all of these social factors play a role in the ultimate rates in suicide. So essentially, the less integrated you are into society, the higher levels of what he called anomie you had. And that the term WASP, if you've ever heard this, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males would be the most likely to commit suicide because they have the highest rate of anomie, or the lowest social integration in society. I almost forgot, before I move on to the next theorist, I do want to just kind of quickly talk about some of the other work that Durkheim was known for. And some of those include the division of labor, the rules of sociological method, and elementary forms of social life. I forgot to also mention that Durkheim disagreed with Marx in terms of what was the... Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's move on to Weber. It was actually Weber that disagreed with Marx in terms of what was the central force of change in our society. And Max Weber actually believed that it was religion and not economics that was the central force to change. He asserts that religion is the origin of capitalism. In other words, that religion, because Protestants and Catholics had a different perspective on whether or not they would be saved, Catholics knew that they would be saved, whereas Protestants, in the Protestant perspective, you don't know whether or not you're saved until the day of reckoning. And that because of the human uncomfortableness with not knowing, Protestants looked for a sign or a reason to assume that they were saved, to be able to say that they were blessed by God and therefore a saved soul. And that because they did this, it was actually wealth and the growing wealth of individual Protestants that they took as a sign for being blessed. So therefore, Protestants started really truly living a frugal lifestyle, saving their money and investing their money. And this is the origins, Weber says, of capitalism. And so from there, we get this Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. And he's very well known now for this, or at least this theory itself is very well known. But at the time when he came out with it, it was heavily critiqued idea or theory. In addition to that, Max Weber was a proponent of what we call value-free sociology. So what that means is that Weber really truly asserted this idea of having an unbiased scientific method, that scientists themselves should be unbiased and should have their own values and opinions as neutral. And we try our best to do this when we create our hypothesis and through the steps of the scientific method. And it's still a central idea and pushing force in all science today that we're supposed to start with an unbiased hypothesis or idea and not allow our own interests or judgments affect the research. So we're going to stop here, and the next lecture is going to be on the next several theorists, starting with W.E.B. Du Bois. Thank you.